For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. Today we focus on an industry that is without doubt in a state of transition, that of telecommunications. Telcos have historically believers in the power of customer experience, with a pretty clear line of sight to subscription impact, but it's fair to say they've rarely enjoyed high levels of customer loyalty. Perhaps as a product of a previously regulated industry or limited competition, there's no doubt that the future now, though, is one of complex products, higher customer engagement, and more competition overall. Our guests today are Marc Anné, Chairman of the World Communication Awards Judging Committee, and Harry Baldock, Editor of Total Telecom. The discussion we have explores key industry trends, including the rise of 5G, growing dominance of hyperscalers, and the challenge of telcos transforming into technology companies. We address the persistent revenue struggles of telecom operators despite increased data consumption, and the role of AI in network optimization, customer experience, competitive pressures also from China and the US tech giants. In particular, Marc highlights AI-driven efficiency improvement in telcos from both predictive maintenance to hyper-personalized customer interactions, and Harry reflects on the sector's identity crisis, caught perhaps between innovation and commoditization. Conversation ends with predictions for the next 5 years, always dangerous, emphasizing AI-powered services, private 5G networks for B2B, and the telco's need for strategic partnerships to remain relevant. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Harry, Marc Anné, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard.
I'd like to start off with a bit of a high level conversation about the telecommunications industry in general. So, put some context around what's happening in telecommunications, what's shaping the industry right now. Perhaps, Marc, you could kick that off with your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, let's set the scene and let's get straight to the point, right? Perhaps some interesting figures from the industry. There are around 261 5G services right now, operators in 101 countries. We have around 10.5 billion consumer connections today. In the enterprise segment, which is your area of expertise, we have currently 10.7 billion IoT connections, and that will increase by a factor of 3 by 2030. That's only 5 years from now. The mobile data traffic will even increase more by a factor of 4 between now and 2030. So that's the industry. But telecom, in a certain sense, right, Richard, has become as obvious as water from the tap and as electricity from the socket. As a World Communication Judge, one of my colleagues recently published on LinkedIn, telecoms are like glass. Only when it breaks, everyone notices. Luckily, this only happens comparatively rarely, but that's life. So we find it very useful and very very basic that we are connecting Switzerland with London, with California and Belgium. But it's not that evident when Bell started his inventions. So, by the way, do you know the famous golden 10 seconds rule, Richard?
No, 10 seconds.
To give you an idea of talking about water from the tap, if more than 10 seconds poor network connections, customers switch to another operator these days. So, in other words, service availability, the standards around that are becoming extremely high.
10 seconds. I hadn't heard that one. That's pretty low threshold. Harry, what are your observations?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. And on the one hand, I really agree with Marc, but at the same time, I think this kind of perception that connectivity is everywhere and the telcos are kind of almost becoming a utility. They kind of hate that. They really don't like the fact that they want to be seen as kind of growth companies with
Sure.
innovative service offerings and kind of places where that are still going to make money and not be heavily regulated. And I think probably the kind of one of the biggest things, and I'm sure we'll touch on it more throughout the conversation, is kind of this identity crisis that the telcos are having right now, where they don't want to be this kind of so-called dumb pipe anymore. They want to be much more than that. They want to be potentially a techco. There's this kind of discussion around telco to techco, and they're all kind of doing it to certain different degrees. How effectively they're doing that kind of remains to be seen. And I think it's all kind of based against this backdrop that certainly, at least in Europe, like most of these telcos aren't making a ton of money. Things are pretty flat for these guys, and they're constantly trying to wait and see kind of what's that next big thing that's going to drive their boost. At the moment, obviously, maybe that's AI, but maybe not. And I'm sure we'll speak about that a lot more in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting theme because if they want to get into the techco business, there's some pretty formidable competitors there, right?
Yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
like they're going to waltz in and it's sort of an industry which has a tradition of coming from quasi-monopolistic control and not necessarily being loved by its customers. It doesn't waltz into a brutally competitive industry dominated by very high customer loyalty, very, very effective players, and suddenly say, "Oh, we'd like a seat at the table." That's going to be quite a stretch, isn't it?
Well,
exactly.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Harry was saying, I mean, indeed, there is the declining of the traditional revenue streams they are having with the rise of the over-the-top services like WhatsApp, Skype, name it, which are offering free messaging and calling. There are also the regulatory constraints in some regions, right? Like, for example, in Europe, the inability to merge or to increase prices. The abolition of roaming charges in Europe, etc., etc. So they are in front of quite a lot of challenges. I do agree with that, yes.
And I think the kind of ironic thing is, as you say, they built out all this infrastructure and kind of really enabled smartphone connectivity as we know it today. And the people who came in and took all the money are the people like you say, kind of the Googles, the Metas, and at the same time, now those people are kind of slowly kind of moving towards the telco space in terms of things like cloud and even things like submarine cables. They're huge players in stuff like that because they want to be the ones building the infrastructure that's going to support the data growth that they want. So there's this real push and pull between the real big hyperscalers and the telco industry. Is kind of, I mean, there was even a fair share debate over the last few years, kind of about whether these guys that kind of use the majority of network data consumption, maybe they should be subsidizing the telecoms operators who are having to kind of shell out loads of money for 5G and fiber and things like that. So there's a real big clash, and it's not really clear how that's going to play out.
Yeah, well, I fully agree with Harry. I think the growth in data traffic has not led to corresponding revenue growth, right, in the industry. And the big players, in a certain sense, they're having, at least they had, a permanent free ride on these telecom highways without paying any toll fees, right, at the end of the day. And their magnificent 7 market capitalization and profit, in the meantime, they explode. So
that sounds spoken like a true telco, not paying the fees.
It's true.
I'm sure their perspective's a little bit different on it. But the macro point you're raising here, which is interesting, is that the distribution of profits in this entire sector of technology has obviously skewed massively to the software side of the equation.
Yep.
And the provision of transport, let me call it that, is become less and less, and you'd expect that. I think this is a good segue into talking about customers because innovators in the techco space have always been concerned about retention of customers through innovation, through service. They've been very good at this in general, or they died. Telecommunications has historically come from a place where, let's face it, if you went back 20 years, customers didn't like their telcos at all. I think that things have improved. But Mark, you've been both on the sort of buy side and sell side of this equation. What do you think is happening in terms of customer experience at a macro level?
Well, if you look at it, let's first perhaps look a bit to the customer needs, right, overall these days. There is definitely, if we take B2B to start with, there is definitely a need for scalability and flexibility. So you already mentioned it earlier on, cloud-based solutions, whereby easily customers can be and users can be and services can be added or removed. There are pay-as-you-go prices. There is an enhanced requirement for enhanced collaboration and productivity, right, with seamless integrations, so with unified communication platforms, for example. There is certainly a requirement for proactive support, more and more, but predictive monitoring and analytics if possible. So before an issue occurs, it can potentially be identified upfront and addressed without causing any disruption. The other customer need, which is there, is clearly protect our data, protect our sensitive data and communications with end-to-end descriptions and threat detection services. But that's in the B2B environment. In the B2C environment, what you see there's a clearly a move towards hyper-personalization, right, and a demand for that. Give me my personalized bill with payment options. I want to have personalized marketing campaigns with offers and promotions based on my browsing and purchasing behavior. The omni-channel experience in B2B and B2C is very, very important. So I want to switch from one channel to another. And at the same time, if I start my request on one channel, I want to continue it on another channel, and this without losing context. I also want to have a unified customer profile across all my touch points. So these are the typical, I would say, customer needs which we see both in B2B as well as in B2C from a customer perspective.
I think the really interesting thing here is how competition is getting kind of easier, and in the sense of the consumer space is, if you're a consumer, it's a lot easier to switch provider now today than it used to be. I think there used to be real pressures to kind of ring up your provider, and then they try and talk you into staying with the plan for another 30 minutes, and you have to kind of keep saying no over and over again. And with things kind of like eSIM, and I think some of the stuff, the changes in regulations, again, like certainly here in the UK and in Europe, I think in the US as well, it's getting to the point now where if you're a consumer, you can just kind of shop around and change your provider without too much trouble. And that, I think, in many ways is an opportunity for the telcos to kind of really differentiate themselves and do something different. But I think, again, it kind of comes back to this identity crisis in many ways, in that for the vast majority of customers, they don't really care whether it's 4G or 5G. They don't really care whether they're on fiber or Wi-Fi. They don't care about the technological backing of it. They just care that it works.
Right.
And certainly for some segments, like things like gaming and stuff like that, I think that's where the telcos are looking at it and going, well, these are people that actually would pay a premium for things like service quality and speed. But for general like consumption by normal users, people don't really want to pay a premium for things like 5G, and don't necessarily see the need to have a gigabit fiber connection.
Right.
So it's an interesting time.
I mean, all of these factors eventually turn into, basic hygienic factors. And so you can make an argument the telco industry has approached and exceeded that point now where, to all intents and purposes, we don't care. We saw it in the PC industry. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the release of a new Intel chip was an exciting event because your machine would go faster, and now, does anyone pay attention to CPU speeds? I mean, I didn't even understand the marketing for it anyway, but the fact is we've reached a point where that kind of performance is now commoditized, and telcos surely are in the same place where you're not going to persuade people that another 20% improvement in speed is going to materially change their lives in the same way it might have done when we went to 3G or 4G. So to your point, are people even going to notice? They're going to say, which network am I on right now? Who cares is the answer. How do telcos deal with that sheer level of ambivalence to their product?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really hard. I think, we've got Mobile World Congress coming up in Barcelona, the biggest kind of conference in the telecom sector next month, and I feel like every year I go there's a different kind of theme that's supposedly going to kind of solve this problem, whether that's the metaverse using kind of VR and AR and things like that, or maybe now AI. I think the telecoms industry has often relied on this kind of build it and they will come kind of mentality. If we build out high quality infrastructure, and you certainly don't want to be seen to be building out slower than your competitors, whether that's domestically or abroad, so everybody's racing to do this, something will come along and help you monetize that further down the line. And yeah, as you say, I think with the kind of the app store and apps and the smartphone streaming, things like that happened for 4G, hasn't kind of happened for 5G yet, and I think they're kind of still kind of hoping that sooner or later something will come along that really demands that you have this higher speed, this higher quality connection, and people won't be able to do without that. But for the time being, it's not really here yet.
Yeah, I agree with Harry certainly when it concerns the B2C market. I'm not necessarily full in agreement with him when it concerns the B2B market, because 5G in the B2B market is there can be a lot of critical applications, right? So where they require faster speeds, where they require lower latency or enhanced connectivity in the area, for example, of healthcare, in the area, for example, remote surgery. Think about it. You need to have extreme low latency. This remind me of one of the submission of the World Communication Awards, whereby now a Chinese operator is offering a very low latency 5G service for unmanned aerial vehicles, for example. So you can imagine, and in that case, with the 4G, you couldn't get the thing off the ground. Secondly, you need to have the minimum possible the latencies and the highest possible speed, as you always need for cars. So I think there's a difference between the B2C world these days, and I fully agree with Harry, and the B2B world.
Yeah, I mean, we're a big AWS shop because we run all our AI on AWS. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know what technological telecommunications infrastructure we consume. I don't care. Exactly. AWS is massively innovative. The notion that they care about us as a customer strikes me as very upfront in their way of thinking, both in terms of innovation, the way they account manage. It's just going to be very hard for me to imagine that the telco, certainly here in the States, is going to suddenly come along and compete effectively with a company like that is, massive degree of innovation. And yeah. Mark, this was kind of relevant to when you and I were, you obviously head up the whole judging section for the World Communication Awards. Mm-hmm. We've sat through all of these customer experience presentations over the years, probably over the last 4 or 5 years now. And 80% of them I would characterize as, we found a better tweak to the network, right? And customer experience equals better network performance. So maybe the big question is, are they completely off the mark here? And I'll give a counterpoint. If you remember, you all know O'Leary from Ryanair, of course, who once famously said that the guys who run BA, in fact, the other national carriers, he described them as aerosexuals because they're in love with planes. Right? Are the telco CEOs in love with networks? And is that the problem? They simply can't get out of that mentality. On the record, Harry, are they network sexuals? Is that the correct term?
I'm not sure I'd go quite that far. I do think this is a big challenge, though, is that they are looking for some other way to engage with customers, and whether that's kind of building some kind of super app or kind of engaging with these over the top people to bundle things together into kind of viable ways to differentiate themselves from their competitors. I think it's a real challenge for them, and I don't think they've really worked out quite how to do it. And I think there is a different appetite between the different players to how many are quite happy just to say, oh, we're just going to do communications, we're going to do it really well. We're not fussed about doing entertainment, doing apps, doing all these other kind of other things that obviously the hyperscalers do so well in kind of so many different areas. But there are other ones that are very much not happy and really do want to kind of change the business model quite drastically away from just traditional services.
Let's switch gears for a second. Mark, I'd like you to comment on AI here. So as you've been sitting through all the submissions for the World Communication Awards for years, AI is obviously starting to creep into this. What do you see as the most interesting applications of artificial intelligence now within the telco space?
Yeah, I think that there are some interesting evolutions, I would say, in what we see in the submissions from the World Communication Award, and by the way, in general, in terms of how the industry is evolving. I think, at least in last year, AI proved to be the year of the integration into telecommunication. At least we saw some interesting, and I can give some examples if you want on that, recently in the submissions last year, whereby indeed AI models were leveraged and some large language models as such, because, by the way, we have already an AI award, as you know, Richard. So we see some interesting trends upcoming. So at least some of the telco CEOs, some of them at least have some sensitivity for going beyond their network connection. So to give you some examples, to read some practical examples, I think that's more interesting than to talk theoretically. For example, we had a submission with an RFP AI response generator, whereby it created automatically recommendations based on historical data collection of past RFPs, and thanks to that, the time took reduced from a couple of weeks to a couple of hours. So at least there was efficiency in terms of productivity. We saw some other examples whereby the new partner onboarding was happening based with the AI support, whereby it now takes 30 minutes in place of 1 to 3 days. So again, efficiency improvements. We saw the launch of telco GPT services, now not chat GPT or not DeepSeek GPT, but telco GPT services, at least based on trained data, telco data training materials with embedded copilots. We saw submissions with maintenance AI inspections, and also with robots, AI-powered chatbots are there too, and virtual assistants, although I'm not that a big fan of it yet, based on my own experience, at least here out of Belgium. Not going to go into more details. Invoice explanations and analytics, for example. There was a US operator who is now sorting a billing issue in 1 minute. Otherwise, it might take 1 to 3 days. So that's one area. So the automation of telco processes. On the other hand, we see a bit more technical, but AI-driven network optimization, whereby they launch AI-driven dashboards with real-time insights and recommendations for optimizing network performance based on the usage patterns, for example. We had a Korean operator, for example, who's focusing on enhancing customer 5G experience with a CX, customer experience quality analysis system, utilizing AI and leveraging 1 billion customer quality data. Others are proactively starting to recognize anomalous data pattern behaviors and defining actionable insights and network management tools. There's, of course, in the area of security, also AI there starts getting introduced in telcos with the AI-powered anti-phishing and spam systems in real time, blocking millions of illegal messages. At some examples, we had an example, I think it was out of the UK, as far as I remember. It stopped voice and messaging fraud by eliminating artificial traffic, and it reduced the customer complaints on unsolicited traffic by 98%. And there was another Korean operator who launched an AI model to detect phishing messages in real time, blocking 800,000 messages monthly and intercepting 1 million illegal messages as such on a monthly basis. And last but not least, in the area of B2B, so there's a lot to tell, as you can see, Richard. So the people are catching up, at least some operators are catching up. A kind of AI-enhanced knowledge management system, a bit similar to the telco chat GPT, but not only engineers, but now also the average employee can conduct analysis without the need for deep technical knowledge, and in other words, getting faster response times and enhancing accuracy of information to customers. In the B2C area, we already touched upon it partially. There is AI hyper-personalization based on the usage patterns and personal recommendations. The use of 360 customer engagement with AI-based guided selling. Some telcos are starting doing it, whereby it recommends the next best action for the sales guy or the call agent. Real-time marketing in a certain sense, converting real-time behaviors, decision, and omnichannel orchestration. I can go on. Just one last example.
Yeah.
In the WCA, they also launched. That was, I think, Saudi Arabian indeed operator launched the first autonomous telecom store, integrated advanced AI, machine learning, sensor fusion, robotics, and facial recognition. So at least some light points at the end of the dark tunnel.
I was going to say, other than that, what have the telcos ever done for us?
I mean, they're trying really hard.
They're trying.
I mean, really, that's what I take away from that is, there's across the whole industry, there's a tremendous amount of investment and innovation. And perhaps, Harry, you could build on that. There's also in the background, of course, and it's been huge for the US markets, has been the emergence of DeepSeek. Now, a lot of that has been, you've had sort of two axes perspective on that. One has been, how did they build a large language model for $5 million, which they didn't, but still wasn't, certainly did enough to wipe out, $1 billion off NVIDIA's market cap. The flip side of that, though, was the Chinese are coming, right? Which here in the US, there is no political support for China in the United States. Europe has much more is much more fence sitting. But how do you see the impact of China now and DeepSeek on the whole telco industry?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a snapshot for what we've been seeing for the past kind of 5, maybe even in 10 years, really, in terms of there's this weird kind of almost tripartite balance between the US, obviously kind of duking it out with China in terms of technology, and Europe's kind of caught in the middle going, oh God, what do we do? I think in terms of DeepSeek, I don't think we should probably be too surprised that this has kind of turned up. I think, China as a nation has a long history in terms of technology, of kind of watching what other nations are doing and kind of finding a way to do this cheaper and kind of at a relatively comparable level for a cheaper price. I mean, it's essentially what we saw in the telecoms industry with Huawei taking on Nokia and Ericsson. They've kind of came out of nowhere, and I think to a certain extent that's the nature of China, where you have kind of a more centralized state, to put it lightly, but it kind of means that these big tech businesses really can kind of plow forward at a pace that you simply can't do in a more regulated environment, certainly like Europe. And I think that's been part of the big challenge. In terms of kind of using the technology, I don't know. I think we're increasingly moving towards this more like isolationist approach to technology itself. I think the US is kind of using its geopolitical influence to kind of pressurize Europe to kind of take the same stances that they have towards technology, and kind of support these primarily US companies. The Europe has its own kind of AI darlings. We've got Mistral with Claude and things like that. So we're not completely kind of out of the running and don't have a homegrown alternative. But it's a real struggle.
You're not quite there with the whole America innovates, Europe regulates sort of narrative. There's more. You're more optimistic than that, or less?
I think more so. I think there's definitely a kind of feeling that within Europe that we can't keep things going at the pace that they've been going. We need to try and make the environment more appealing for investment, whether that's the AI sector, kind of data centers, like all of this kind of stuff. The extent to which we can kind of unravel that bureaucracy and actually do it in practice is much harder.
Right.
And I think that's just the nature of you've got the US market, which is what 300 something million people, and then obviously China over 1 billion. You've got essentially roughly the same amount of people in Europe as the US, but you've got however many countries, and the kind of harmonizing that regulatory framework and balancing it all out is not something that we can really expect to be done. I mean, probably ever.
just picking up on that, I mean, there's two things struck me. First of all, Mario Draghi's recent report on the competitiveness of the European Union, which, if you read past all the gentle politicization of it, basically said we're not doing very well, and in fact we really need to rethink our entire approach to competitiveness and innovation. And secondly, AI-based regulation, where you're seeing a huge divergence. The US has already staked out its tent on this, which is we're fundamentally anti-regulatory, we're pro-competitiveness. You've got the Europeans who've started down this path of AI regulation very much, no, this is dangerous, we need to regulate it. And Britain, perhaps, speaking as a Brit, sort of sitting on the fence, which is a place we seem most comfortable around for this. Are we seeing these two themes, these counter pressures? On one hand, Europe needs to fundamentally become more competitive. Secondly, it still has a regulatory tendency. Is that going to impact the telco industry? I mean, is the fence sitting the right place to be? What are your thoughts, Mark? Perhaps you could chip in.
Well, perhaps going back to the initial discussions you covered earlier on. I think there might be, talking in terms of innovation, I think the US clearly has AI models based on, let's say, privatized environments. The Chinese came up with so-called, or coming up with a kind of open source type of AI solution, where it's based on only generated based on 65 million. I don't believe in either, but at least imagine that would be the case. At least it would open the door and roll out the carpet for other countries, including Europe, also to democratize, in a certain sense, open source AI solutions and make it available, at least accessible to all, in order to fuel innovation. On the other end, of course, you have the regulatory constraints, without any doubt. One could say that at least they're a bit on the severe side, and the problem is that they are just covering the actual situation of the status of technology, and they're not necessarily incorporating the future, right? If the ongoing, very fast future evolutions in there, and that is what me worries most, because at the end of the day, that could be a real block on which could delay the innovation going forward. But I think at least there is a consciousness coming up in Europe. There has been this famous French AI conference very recently, whereby people are realizing that indeed they need to be a bit more. I don't think that we have to overrule all the existing regulatory constraints, because I do believe that some of them are ethical and are very important to monitor somewhat, because otherwise we might get back into the Wild West, and that is not necessarily the right solution either. So I think it's finding the right balance, I think, between innovation and some monitoring of regulation and ethical constraints and etc. But trying to move forward. On the other hand, Europe still has a lot of, as you know, has a lot of limitations. There's not a unified capital market. Every country is still doing things on its own. Look, indeed, with the AI conference, suddenly Mr. Macron is claiming to be the leading the Musk of Europe, for example. Is not necessarily a European answer for the time being. So we still have a long way to go. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I think it's kind of one of those weird scenarios where Europe has always kind of benefited from the lack of regulation in other countries by kind of being more economically developed in the first place, so they're better able to harness the kind of technology and the kind of the apps and the scenarios that come out from all these other countries, and like, for example, making the use of Huawei technology and things like that, the stuff that's coming out of China. I think the place that it changes is now in the kind of political climate that we're in. These companies are going to be less able to use stuff quite so liberally. There's going to be a lot more kind of distinctions about what kind of technology you use. What does this mean for the data privacy, but also things like national security? Like, you don't want the government kind of coming in and telling you after you spent millions and billions on technology that you can't use this anymore. And that's the kind of thing that we have kind of seen happen. So I think, yeah, it's going to be striking the right balance. And as Mark says, regulation always comes kind of too late, right? Like, it's never looking far enough forward.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think everybody's kind of watching what's going on in the US and the AI market very closely. Yeah, I wouldn't know how it's going to play out over the next 6 months, but I guarantee the telcos are watching it very, very closely.
Yeah, and I think if I may add to that, going to China, they imagine that indeed DeepSeek is a fully viable open source solution for a lot of training data. Given the fact that the Chinese are the mobile leaders in the world, right? They're having the highest number of subscriptions. Also, the Chinese government, of course, we know, has substantial shares in these companies. But the point is, if they would merge intelligently the AI knowledge they have, if it would be applicable and it would be valuable and it would be workable, into their already leaderships they have in telecom today. So they might potentially, in that case, might take a kind of go faster than other regions in the world, at least in the telecom industry. Because if we've seen already with Chinese operators today, right? They are very much focused already on AI, and especially on various industry sectors, water conservation, flood control, that kind of stuff. So they are really going very, very, very fast. I remember one submission. Talking about innovation, one submission of the WCA, this was 3 years ago, and probably Harry remembers that too. There was a Chinese operator who had an IoT device hooked onto all the cows in the Chinese highlands in order to identify their geographical position. This was 3-4 years ago already. Just to give you an idea, don't underestimate that.
Interesting. I mean, I can tell you, looking at large American corporations' attitudes towards data and security, I think the likelihood that Chinese-based large language models become part of the corporate infrastructure is very, very low. I mean, there's already a high degree of anxiety over the use of large language models in corporate America, and the data security provisions, the way things get run through China, is just not going to fly. Consumer is going to be quite different, of course. It is more the Wild West. I'd love you guys to wrap up with maybe just quick 30 seconds each on, where you see this industry 5 years from now. An impossible question to answer, but we will be back in 5 years to verify that whether you were correct or not. If you were to look for 5 years in the future, and maybe we'll start with you, Marc. Who's going to be winning the awards 5 years from now? What are they going to be doing to get on stage?
Well, I think the customer focus is going to be critical. I think AI-driven customer service platforms are going to definitively help to personalize the services and making them more efficient, and also tracking new revenues and new customers, because that's one of the problems a lot of telcos are having indeed today. I would say for the ones who are going to further massively invest in 5G, but in 5G private networks for the B2B environment, are going to be winners. And with edge computing, the ones who are going to be able of pulling together the unstructured data sets from customer service and network operation, bringing them together in one integrated dashboard, being proactive as possible in their analytics and in their actions, training their AI models, are going to, in my view, being the big differentiators. So I think there's going to be a lot around innovation, I think. Applying, of course, the latest technology, but not applying for it on its own, but really in function of customer requirements and customer needs. Setting up strategic partnerships, because they can't do it on their own anymore. Certainly not the telcos. They are very much dependent on other parties, as we all know. So offering bundled services, working with technology providers will be key. And also, don't forget sustainability initiatives. I know it's less of an issue these days. It's got a bit of less of value in the US, but eco-friendly practices and promoting some digital inclusion, at least in parts of the world, and Europe might make a difference. I think these are some criteria which I think could have.
That's a long list. We're gonna hold you to that. The smart answer, Harry, is to keep it really short, because there's less risk.
Well, I think the only thing we know for sure, right, is that there's going to be more data, whether that's going to be consumer data points or things from IoT sensors that are getting embedded everywhere. We're going to have more infrastructure, and I think telco success really relies on how well they leverage that data, not only for their own operations, which I think they already do fairly well, but it's how well they're going to be able to use that to make things that people actually want to use and want to pay for. At the moment, I don't really see any kind of clear steps in that direction, so I wouldn't say I'm too optimistic for where they're going to be in 5 years' time when this next kind of investment cycle comes around with things like for 6G. But who knows? Maybe 6G will come along and we'll be kind of talking to robots using chips in our brains and all that kind of stuff, and that might be the savior that the telco industry has been looking for so long.
That's interesting observation. Maybe the three of us will all be essentially avatars, or at least AI generated models, having this conversation without us even showing up. We'll just, and perhaps it'll turn out to be even more intelligent if
I
we're
could
not
be a
actually
deep fake
present.
right now, Richard. You'd never know.
If I had a deep fake, he'd have more hair. That's for sure. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Wonderful conversation. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.